Poland has quietly become a popular destination for immigrants in Europe. While countries such as Germany, Sweden, the UK, and France are more commonly associated with immigration, Poland is now home to 2.5 million foreign-born individuals, accounting for around 6% of its total population of approximately 38 million. This is a fairly novel development. Although Poland was ethnically diverse prior to World War II, it became highly homogeneous afterwards and remained so for decades. The first waves of immigration to Western countries started while Poland was undergoing economic shock therapies in the 1990s. This trend intensified further when Poland joined the EU in 2004. It's estimated that over 2 million Poles now live abroad, though the figure may be higher. Over the last decade, Poland has experienced an influx of foreigners, despite the fact that the political debate has been clouded by the anti-immigration sentiments of the conservative Peace Party for quite some time. Currently, migration is once again one of the most heated topics in the country. In this episode of European Glimpse, I spoke to Dr. Sara Bojarczuk about the challenges and the changes in migration patterns and debates in Poland. She's a researcher at the Center of Migration Research at the University of Warsaw. Before we begin, I would like to thank you for listening to this podcast. Share your thoughts on the podcast, suggest a topic, or write me at europeanglimpse@gmail.com. I'm your host, Alice, and now let's get into the conversation. Welcome, Sara. I'm glad that you took some time to talk with me about the current state of migration policies in Poland. And I've been very curious to talk with somebody about this topic because in 2013-14, I spent a year in Wrocław as a master's student, and I've been following the developments in the country ever since. And I visited this year again. I visited a couple of years ago, and I have the sense that there's been so much going on, which a lot of people don't know. I would say that the baseline of what the general perception in particularly Western Europe is that Poland has a rather conservative approach when it comes to migration. Walk me through the changes over the last years when it comes to migration in Poland.
First of all, thank you for inviting me. So to tell you a little bit of what's going on at the moment, I think it's important to look back about 10, 15 years ago. Throughout the time, there has been many changes, and Poland has been initially, for a long time, seen as country of emigration, and especially after 2004, where a number of people emigrated to Western countries like UK or Ireland predominantly, then further Germany, Netherlands, and other European countries. There has been a lot of perception that Poland is the country that sends people abroad. But what happened is at the time of EU enlargement, Poland faced quite high level of unemployment, and that was partly the strategy that people decided to take to manage their livelihoods. But eventually what happened is because of that large scale of emigration, we faced the labor shortages that were not that visible until 2010, 2015. That kind of coincided with what was happening in the eastern border, especially in the Ukraine. So primarily while Poland was sending people, Poland was also accepting many Ukrainians, predominantly for seasonal works in agriculture, with time to construction and some sort of manufacturing work, but that was still relatively small scale. The first peak for Ukrainian migration to Poland was around 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, where that migration scale became quite apparent, and Ukrainians were the top immigrants who came to Poland. They've also received quite a special treatment in terms of conditions for coming. They could come on with time on simplified procedure where they didn't have to apply for special visa. Only the employers could give the declaration that they're going to hire this particular person, and that was pretty much it. So it was quite simple. That simplification also applied to other post-Soviet countries. So that's quite important to note that it already then became quite open for foreign workers. And for a long time, Ukrainians were the major group of migrants. However, after 2014, that became to change. And as much as we faced big influx of Ukrainian migrants, that was also the case for other, for example, Georgians or Belarusians and Russians as well. In 2022, after the full-scale Russian invasion, we accepted over 1 million. I mean, with transit, it was more than 1 million. It was around 4 million at the peak time. But in terms of those who actually stayed in Poland for a longer time, we talk about point two Ukrainian citizens, predominantly women. Previous wave was mostly men because they were coming for seasonal work and kind of harder agricultural work. But now we talk about women who fled the war. At the same time, they were quite established in Polish labor market. And so that way they were also in a position to perhaps not negotiate the conditions, but have wider variety of jobs to do. But also the kind of jobs that were available in Poland were not quite adequate to the type of people who came. Because when we talk about predominantly agricultural work, we see men who do more kind of heavier work, more physically demanding job. But at the same time, we got, in kind of colloquially speaking, is mothers with children and women. So the supply and demand side was not quite matching. Women after 2002 were more kind of directed to the service sector, beauty sector, for instance, or cleaning shops and so on. But farmers were still in the need for workers. And so they expanded the search for more broader nationalities. So at the moment, we talk about Nepalese, Colombians, other Latin American nationalities, Asian nationalities. But it's also worth mentioning that, for instance, when we talk about Vietnamese minority, they are quite well established. They have historically well-developed roots in Poland, and they have well-established community. They're quite hermetic and they're quite closed, but they are still quite a large number as well. So I think at the moment, from country of emigration, where we're sending people to other Western countries, we became country of immigration with quite diverse backgrounds of those coming. However, the moods and the general attitudes are changing. And I think this is quite interesting to talk about because the general policies are very connected with labor market. So unlike, for instance, in Germany, labor market participation rate among Ukrainians is over 80%, whereas in Germany is below 50%. So we can see quite differences. This is caused predominantly by language, but also the fact that Poland has much different and perhaps, different needs in the labor market and needs different type of people. But still, they're quite welcomed in the Polish labor market. But there is not many opportunities for those who come to the country but don't work. And I think we also face the narrative that is a bit like there are those who are more desirable and those who are more welcomed versus those who are not.
I would like to talk with you a little bit about the different types of people, the different types of groups that are in Poland and how the attitudes and the policies have changed. What I think is quite interesting, you described this traditional movement, people from the East moved towards the West, and just as Polish citizens moved westward, there are people from more Eastern countries who moved to Poland for labor opportunities. So we definitely have this one group of labor migration or labor migrants, which have access to different opportunities in the Polish agricultural sector. As you said, we have as well refugees. The Ukrainians kind of merged from labor migrants to becoming this group of refugees. And I would like to as well talk with you a little bit on how that has changed. And I think something which has been as well part of the debate is illegal immigration. We recently have been seeing the resurgence of border controls on the Polish-German border, on the Polish-Latvian border. It has been occurring. And what I'm interested in is the Ukrainian shift, so to say, from labor migration to refugee status, and perhaps where we stand now in Poland. I would like to know, how did Poland manage to so quickly integrate so many people? What role do policies play in the experience perhaps with the labor migration that you have been gaining for a decade to as well the refugees who had to flee in 2022?
So let's start with the Ukrainian refugees, or I usually call them morphling refugees, because they came to Poland and to Europe in general, on a little bit different terms than any other refugees. If we compare, let's say, those who come from Syria or Middle East in general, they are treated completely different than those who came from Ukraine. In Poland and, well, overall in Europe, there was the European regulation allowing them to come and receive support. Poland additionally implemented the special law that allowed Ukrainian people to come and work pretty much straight away. They didn't need any work permit. They had support if they received a special PESEL number, or the personal identification number. So as they had this number, they had all sort of social welfare provision. By social welfare, I mean mostly healthcare. They had some sort of special support, financial support, but that was relatively minor. And this is quite, I would say, unique in Poland, because that social welfare support, apart from healthcare, which is, if you work, it's widely accessible, it's quite low. So those who come, they don't really have much choice to not to work in a way. So I think that helped to engage those people in the labor market quite quickly. Besides, similarly to Czech Republic, there are many language similarities. Unlike in Germany, where language is quite different and they need to learn language separately, in Poland, if you come to Ukraine, it's quite doable to communicate, and I mean in the simple jobs, but Polish and Ukrainian is quite similar. Besides, Poland, by having experience of already dealing with Ukrainian workers and Ukrainian migrants in the public sphere in general, we were quite used to them. And if we talk about just simply kind of visual features, you can't really spot the difference on a street, if you know what I mean. Whereas if someone comes from much further countries, then you can see that they are different. And I think this is one of the major factors, especially that Poland was not used to that much, to having, people coming from various nationalities. So certainly the language helped, certainly the policies helped that allowed them or permitted them to come. That simplified procedure was also extended, so they could come and work up until 2 years with kind of formal procedures or formal permits, as long as they have refugee status or that's PESEL. So I think this was major in terms of allowing that to happen and allowing them to integrate. The fact that there was already Ukrainian migration, quite big Ukrainian migration in Poland, also helped with the networks. And I think although policies are quite important in allowing or facilitating access to labor market, we cannot forget the role that community plays when we talk about migration communities and diasporas. So this was also crucial, also in terms of help with accommodation and other kind of navigating in the new country. Some people also, from the research that we've done in our institute, we found that some people also continued working online while living in Poland. So they were not formally in the Polish labor market, but they were also kind of, contributing to the economy somehow. That changed with time, but indeed, that was also a factor.
I would like to know how the view on the Ukrainian population that is now in Poland has shifted from a policy perspective and as well from a civil perspective. I'm asking this question because I observe how in Germany the mood has been shifting as well towards Ukrainian refugees, where in the beginning there was a lot of support, there was a lot of empathy as well for this humanitarian crisis that was unfolding. But now I see calls for reduced access to welfare services, for instance, and higher demands placed towards this particular subgroup. After, unfortunately, 3.5 years after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, how would you describe the current policies and sentiments towards the Ukrainian refugees?
Well, policies haven't changed much in a way that Ukrainians are still allowed to work. They're still allowed to receive support if they're entitled to. What's changed is that children are obliged to go to Polish schools. They no longer can continue being in kind of online school. They have to attend to Polish school if the parent wants to receive those social welfare support. There was a debate regarding the equivalent of child benefit to take it away from those migrants, but it has been abandoned because it was not fair. What changed is the attitudes, as you've said, because at the very beginning, in February 2022, what happened in Poland was actually amazing. People hosted those refugees in their homes. There were separate centers where people were sending food, clothes. People were, providing or kind of trying to help with jobs, trying to help with accommodation, with looking after children. And that, at that time, it was absolutely heartwarming and it was amazing. But what happens is it's changed over time. And what's important is to come back to when I said about diversity of migrants, because Ukrainian migrants are still the ones that are sort of, I don't want to say more prioritized because that would imply that there is a power imbalance, but they're the ones who are preferred, both in terms of those kind of social norms, but also in terms of labor market. And when we talk among other migrants, because they are so well integrated and they kind of embedded in the labor market. But the public attitudes have changed and the political narrative has changed. What I observe is it has changed because of the asylum seekers and because of the border crossing or pushbacks at the Polish-Belarusian border, or the ones that are pushed back from Germany.
Yeah, it's all being lumped together. That's as well my experience. It's just a sense of being overwhelmed, I guess. This is what a lot of average citizens experience on a just emotional level. But where do you think is the perspective going when we look at specifically the group of Ukrainians in Poland?
In my opinion, policies are now focused on those, big words of security and this sort of defending from non-European citizens. When we look at the Ukrainians, I also forgot to mention that at the time in 2018, when the seasonal working permit has been introduced to the European legislation from 2013, but it got implemented in Poland in 2018. That was predominantly dominated with Ukrainian citizens. And in 22, employers didn't have to do any declaration or any sort of inform that they are going to hire a Ukrainian person. They had a certain time to just declare to the office to say, I'm hiring Ukrainian person. And that has been also kind of another simplification towards hiring Ukrainians. But I think what is going to change is certainly being more strict towards it. And we can see already, if we look at even Eurostat data, the number of first work permits in Poland was in the peak until 2022 or so. Whereas now we are back into the country that pretty much hardly issues any of them. And that reflects directly the kind of political scene. So in terms of Ukrainians, I would say they are pretty established in the migratory scene, but I think it's not enough in terms of labor market in Poland. So we need other workers, and this is the problem.
Walk me a little bit through the development of labor migration, because when you already mentioned the Vietnamese as one group, I as well noticed during my recent visit in April that there have been a lot of Georgian bakeries in Wrocław. So I had the impression that this group has emerged quite a lot as well as one group of labor migrants. Tell me a little bit about the composition of labor migration and as well what are traditional or typical pathways how labor migrants enter the workforce if we exclude agriculture, because I think this is the most common.
Well, typically is to get a visa or, the work permit that would last for a few months. And that really depends on the job. We do also have a lot of involvement from intermediaries that would help those people to come. Ethically has been also quite challenging. So when we talk about composition, perhaps it's worth mentioning the sectors that are the most commonly occupied by migrants. And here we talk about manufacturing, we talk about services, so anything from gastronomy to hotels or sales and so on. So that's some sort of hierarchy in it, because when we talk about sales or shops, if you go to the shop, you would see a Ukrainian person who is kind of that customer handling, who's doing customer handling job, but those who are at the back are those other migrants in a way. Also, migrants occupy, for example, recently we've been doing work in one of the projects where they deal with like rubbish and recycling business. Of course, transport and taxi, this is Bolt and Uber taken over personal transport scene, and this is predominantly occupied by Turkish, Georgians, and all sort of different minorities. You can hardly see a Polish person working, and you rarely now can see Ukrainian person because they moved on to different jobs. And this is the transport is for those who kind of come to Poland either as a transit country because they have to work, let's say, in Poland for 30 days to be able to go to Germany, for instance, or those who just come here and they don't have any prospects for job. They would just take up the transport job. And when we talk about nationalities, as I've mentioned, Ukrainians are now established and they are the largest groups. But we talk about those who come from Uzbekistan, from Georgia, and they are the ones who are part of this simplified procedure. So for them, it's also quite easy to come. We did have Russians, but now their entry has been suspended. We also have Belarusians, although again, their entry is also questionable. So it is changing quite profoundly.
Tell me a little bit about how you perceive the Polish society changing with a more and more diverse labor market, with more and more people working in the labor market. You are based in Warsaw, and my impression is that the big cities in Poland are more and more looking like Western European cities in many ways. Culturally, when you look at the shops, the services, everything that is being offered, but as well when you look demographically at the type of people that you find there. Explain to me, perhaps, if there was a change over the last years that you feel in Polish society when it comes to diversity of people and how it feels like.
Certainly, you can see that more diversity. I haven't been living in Poland for 15 years, and I came back to Poland 5 years ago. And I can see it's a completely different country now. What's important, I think, it's also to note that when we talk about manufacturing and when we talk about those migrants coming from, let's say, Latin America or African countries, they are based in the factories that are slightly outside of big cities. So they are visible, but they're not as present, for example, as those who work in Warsaw in companies, let's say, or in corporations. So I think this is important point because we know that they are here, but they're not sort of fully present in the social space. So that partially helps because they are not kind of as visible, but doesn't help in a way that once they are seen, they're like, still quite, there's quite a shock, especially when we talk about those small villages outside of the bigger cities. And when we talk about changes in terms of attitudes, well, we can also see that Polish society is quite polarized in terms of their attitudes, and that also reflects the political choices in terms of government. And the presidential election, I think, were the best example where we had two political candidates that were totally opposite. And the difference between them was a couple of percentage points. But what's quite, I would say, interesting to note is that when we talk about those sort of shifting attitudes toward migrants and being more radical and perhaps more conservative, during the peace government that was by default center-right, the policies were quite liberal and the access to labor market by foreigners was liberal, whereas now the sort of center-left government is the one who keeps pushing for more control, more kind of limitation of inflow of, migrants, but in their policy domains, they mean asylum seekers.
And my impression is that there's a lot of debate about control. You need to have the sense of control. And this pattern that you described, that with a ruling conservative party, that you have factually more access or more liberal policies in certain ways when it comes to labor migration, for instance. It's not that uncommon, I think, but I believe that there's a lot of acceptance for such policies because it is framed as something that is happening in an orderly manner, which is structured. And this again contrasts the, I believe, current debate about being overwhelmed, about a lack of control, perhaps, which is why as well left-leaning governments everywhere are adopting more and more strict policy narratives when it comes to migration. That's quite interesting. I would like to talk with you about the conflicts that are currently emerging with the border controls. I personally am very annoyed by the fact that there's border control again on the Polish-German border. I just, first of all, I don't think that the European Union was about that. I think freedom of movement is one of the core pillars. And second, I think it's just so symbolic that you have again a border on Germany and Poland, which as well irks me quite a bit. The debate on the German side is, I wouldn't even say that there's much of a debate. People are kind of accepting it as a necessity, but I know that people who are regularly traveling are very annoyed by it. Explain to me how on the Polish side this particular development has been reflected.
Well, I'm also quite annoyed about it because similarly to what you've said, I think it's quite symbolic, first of all, Polish-German border, but also it's symbolic for European Union and for Schengen, because by default, these meant to be free-flowing, mutually trusting spaces. And at the moment is like we're fighting with another member state about why would you send people back? And then there is this sort of, as you said, in Germany, the debate hardly exists. In Poland, in media, it's, really blown up in a way that, that narrative that the German state or German police is pushing back those migrants. In general, the concept of pushback is controversial, but they're really bringing them back because they were caught around the border, and they were sort of their first state that they arrived to was Poland. So by law, they are there. But even when we talk about it, for me, it's absurd because we talk about numbers like 5 people per week or per month. And it's really, if we look at the scale of migration overall and the general issue of migration and asylum seeker, the numbers when we talk about those people who come across the borders, they are really minor. And I know it might happen that once we tolerate it, it might escalate as it was on the Polish-Belarusian border. But really, we should focus on improving what works or improving what doesn't work in Poland rather than dealing with, this sort of pushing back and forth of people who happen to be caught at the border. And they are not there because they want to. And I think this is something that does not get through the political mindset of this kind of, security and control, because those people are not there because they had a good life somewhere else. And it's not that someone wakes up one day and say, okay, my life is so great here in, I don't know, Tunisia or Afghanistan, I'll just go and visit Europe. These are people who flee the war and conflicts and any other climate migration or any other humanitarian reasons. And it's our responsibility to treat them in a humanitarian way. And beyond that, what we can see at the Polish-German border is also they have been those groups of people who called themselves like a monitoring group, and they are totally independent. They're not sanctioned by any legal regulation. And there's just a group of men who are really devoted to fight against migration. And they are there to patrol those borders independently. By independently, I mean, of course, sort of with a negative connotation for migrants, to show how it really happens, how bad Germany is. And it's just getting out of hand, I would say.
Tell me a little bit about that group. Do they as well have some paramilitary features? Because I know that 10 years ago, a similar pattern of men patrolling the Bulgarian-Turkish border appeared, where illegal pushbacks happened to Turkey, particularly when it was Middle Eastern individuals crossing the border, and there was violence. So I would like to know, what does it look like in Poland, this particular group you just mentioned?
It's just a group of men who are based around the border. They transmit a lot of the material online, so you can find their feeds on Facebook or Instagram, and they basically work from the distance because they're not allowed to come too close, and they monitor who comes, and they kind of record these conversations between Polish and German guards and how those people come, and they kind of add the narrative, oh, this is a man, and if he wanted to come and live in Poland, he wouldn't come with a plastic bag full of whatever stuff. And then they add up this sort of narrative that they are the ones who we say we need engineers, and here are your engineers, who are really not qualified workers, but they're just asylum seekers. And they are the ones who also fuel this sort of anti-migration, but here I want to emphasize anti-asylum seeker narrative.
I think a lot of trust is broken on the German-Polish border, and I think it's just the cost is out of proportion. You just said it's just a handful of people if you count it on a monthly basis, and if you look at the cost with border guards, with police, if you look at as well the not tangible but felt trust that you had, I think you just break a lot by setting up a lot of border guards there. But explain to me a little bit what is happening on the other side of Poland, where you mentioned the occurrences that happened on the Polish-Belarusian border some years ago. There was a lot of political debate if staged immigration flows occurred. There's as well border patrols with the Latvian border. What is happening on the northeastern borders of Poland?
So the Polish-Latvian border is not as widely broadcasted in media, perhaps because it doesn't sell as good as Polish-German border. So what is happening there when we get the data from the border guards, then these are just numbers who was admitted and who was refused the entry. And again, these are like a handful of people. But when we talk about Polish and Belarusian border, I think this is much more important. And it is more symbolic in a way that after 2022 became even more fueling in a way that we've witnessed pushbacks. So people who are literally just physically pushed back through the border. At the moment, there is a fence that is monitored, that is wrapped up with the wire. But as with any physical barrier, we know it's not 100% proof. So people do manage to get through. But the narrative that we see in the media and the political debate is that this is part of the kind of hybrid war with Russia. Like it's kind of being portrayed that they're there that aim to destabilize security and the general peace and attitudes as well, like public attitudes in Poland and in Europe in general.
Yeah, that's what I mentioned earlier about a politically engineered migration flows to Europe, and just creating a lot of sense of loss of control again. And I think as well a factor that is always crucial in those debates is anti-Muslim sentiments, Middle Eastern sentiments. I think the different treatment all over Europe, this is not a Polish issue, but all over Europe, there's definitely a different way in how people are being viewed based on where they come from. The debates are emotional. They're on very, very, almost violent levels and militant levels, depending who you ask. But I would like to talk a little bit about something that might be more optimistic, and this is integration policies or integration processes that are happening in Poland. You described a little bit that after you returned after 15 years to Poland, after living abroad, the country has changed so much. The face of Poland has changed with a lot more diverse people from all over the world. And I can imagine that this as well goes along with questions about how does integration look like? Are there particular policies, and how do citizens react when we're talking about Ukrainians, but people basically from all over the world who want to set foot in Poland and make a living?
Well, I think this answer will be much shorter. Are there any integration policies? The answer is no. But there's a great role of NGOs, and they are absolutely invaluable in terms of providing access to any sort of communities and society in Poland. And that was very prevalent in 2022, but up until now, we see quite a lot of those NGOs working hand in hand with migrants. Unfortunately, the funding for them is limited and has been cut off recently with the American policies as well. So it's becoming even more challenging. When we talk about integration, well, for sure, we have to look at children, because they are the ones who access the education system, and this is a starting point for them, but also for education system in Poland, which is unfortunately not very used to having minority children. it is changing. And for example, if we look at schools in Warsaw, it's much more prevalent and common for migrant children to be in schools, in Polish schools. There's also development of other sort of international schools, which are mostly private or community-based, but they are paid, they're not free. And I think when we talk about bigger cities like Warsaw, Kraków, Tricity, perhaps Poznań as well, they are managing more or less. But the problem is in the smaller towns and villages where neither people nor institutions are ready for it. We do have quite heavily politically contested centers of integration, but again, as with anything to do with migration, has been largely politicized. So unfortunately, they are successful in what they're doing, but they are heavily loaded with this sort of anti-migration political narrative. I mean, not the centers, but the whole narrative around creations of those centers. There are policies that, as I mentioned before, enable migrants to participate in the labor market, which is the foundation for any sort of integration. And other than that, I don't think we are quite there yet. So I think it's still in making.
I don't know. My view is that Poland is actually a little bit underestimating how well it's performing. I'm looking at Poland from the perspective of where it came from or where it started 30 years ago. When we think of in the 90s, the post-socialist system imploded and the big immigration waves as well happened because life was difficult. And then with the EU expansion towards the east and everything subsequently that happened in Poland is quite a success story. In my genuine view, Poland is economically growing so fast. It did grow so fast over the last decade. It was one of the top performing countries in those economic terms when we look at GDP growth. And to me, it's, from a distant perspective, it is part of the European integration that Poland as well is becoming more and more attractive to internationals. I noticed that when I was studying there, you have a lot of international students coming into Poland because it's an interesting country, interesting cities, interesting culture. Italians, Spaniards coming for Erasmus, staying there for longer. And I see the sentiment that, of course, integration culture or like modes of integration, until they're formalized, they require experience. And I think it's normal that it's perhaps not as elaborate as in the migration country as I would guess in the United States, for instance, where migration has always been very normal, but it requires experience. Germany didn't do proper immigration policies for decades, even though you have people coming in ever since the late 50s, early 60s. So I think that Poland is underestimating itself a little bit. But I would like to ask another aspect. We started the conversation with the necessity for migration due to labor shortage, with a lot of Polish people moving westward in particular. Do you see any significant trends in the other direction of Polish people who have lived abroad like yourself now moving back to the country which has reached higher prosperity and higher wealth?
Well, for a change, we do have policies that target Polish diaspora abroad. There has been a strategy that has been passed that will deal with the sort of integration or reintegration of Polish migrants abroad. And one of them is attracting people back to come to Poland. I would say there, after Brexit, for instance, you could see some people coming back. You could see those who couldn't stay in the UK, they migrated to other countries. You can see, for instance, those who live in Germany, they do tend to have more circular movements. Similarly with Netherlands, but also the type of migrants that would go to Netherlands is different than, for instance, those who would go to Ireland, because Irish would be, used to be younger and more educated, and so they're now more established and they're just not willing to come back. So for this, we have policies in paper. Not quite sure how it works in practice. There are some, for instance, tax reliefs if you come back for the first year or two, if I remember correctly. If you come back from abroad, you do have a better tax rate. And there are, if you're a scientist, for instance, there are special programs that would attract them back. Polish government, I think, has at last recognized the need to encourage Polish migrants to come back. But I'm not sure how likely it is to happen, because there are always those who, similarly to any migrant in Poland, who did not integrate in their country wherever they decided to come, and they would come back. They go there to earn and come back. But we have to remember that Polish migration is now about 21 years old, in a way that those networks, those sort of habits and circumstances, they're well established in most of the European countries. And if I look back at the time when I was even doing my bachelor's degree, I was also doing it with Polish migrants. And when I was asking them, are you planning to stay? They were telling me, I don't know. And with some of them, I'm still in touch. And I'm asking, do you know now if you're staying or going? You've already bought the house, you have children, and you seem like you're doing pretty well. And this person still tells me, I don't know. And this is quite common for migrants in general, but that's what all the empirical research show, that people are quite hesitant to say, I'm staying or I'm going. After 2004 enlargement, most of the research on Polish migrants showed that people were actually not even unpacking, because they were there just to earn money and come back. And, 20 years later, they've already unpacked, luckily, but they're still not back. And in order for them to be back, it has to be more than just tax relief. There is a reason why they left. Most of them was also economic, but they've learned how it is in different country that is much more open, liberal, and I would say easygoing in a way. And Poland is quite different to it. So I think apart from tax reliefs and apart from the sort of policy solutions, there has to be a little bit more to encourage them to come back. But I'm going to do the research in the forthcoming months on Poles who live in Netherlands. I'll happily find out what do we need to do for them to come back.
I think it's so fascinating how Poland has transitioned from this emigration country to an immigration country. And given the plummeting birth rates and demographic decline, as well as at the same time a growing economy, it seems to me that there's only going to be more and more hunger for people to as well move into Poland and fill the labor spots. When we look at your perspective today, what is your outlook on the Polish migration dynamic for, let's say, the next 2 to 3 years? What do you think is going to come?
Well, I think we're in quite an important moment when it comes to migration, because the political narrative is changing quite dramatically. I'm afraid there will be more cuts and more tightening in terms of especially asylum seekers. We have to remember that the Migration Pact, the European Migration Pact, comes into life next year, if I remember correctly. So this will be also another sort of drop to add to this sort of hatred narrative. What I do hope is that the access to labor market will remain quite smooth for those who want to take the job. I have a feeling that we might go in a way, for instance, like Germany goes, that they would prioritize those who are qualified or highly qualified. I would love to see more investment into Polish diaspora to come back, although this is questionable for more like a logical and ideological reasons. So I don't think we can not have migration. We can't avoid it. In fact, we can't develop without migrants. Of course, there will be push for control. There will be push for more sort of structured and controlled flows. But nonetheless, I don't think we can avoid it. What I would love to see is, first of all, targeting those who smuggle people and those who facilitate those irregular crossings. I would also love to see more humanitarian approach, because after all, labor market and integration is a one thing, but humanitarian approach to anyone crossing the border should be priority, because that also affects the morals of the entire society. And I think I would love to see more openness, because the polarization that is happening in the moment is very concerning.
I fully agree. Polarization is something that we are all pretty concerned, I would say, these days in our societies. And migration, unfortunately, is one of the triggers and the drivers, it seems, of that polarization. Thank you so much for giving me an introduction to how the Polish migration dynamic has changed over the last years. And I'm curious really to see how Poland is going to develop in, let's say, 5 to 10 years, if it's going to take the trajectory of other Western European countries which have embraced more workers, or if it's going to find its very own solution, I think is to be seen. Good luck with your research. And thank you very much for the convo. Thank you for listening to this episode of European Glimpse. This is a passion project of mine, and it would make me very happy if you subscribed or shared this episode with a friend. Now I'm curious to find a new guest. Are you a journalist, a scholar, a student, or perhaps an avid observer of society? If you live in a European country, as well outside of the European Union, reach out to me or recommend somebody I should speak to. I would as well love to hear your feedback on this podcast, as I'm always trying to improve, and my email is europeanglimpse@gmail.com. Take care.